Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to give just a minute until all participants, all attendees connect, and we're going to start soon. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on how MSME value chains condition climate resilience of vulnerable households and farms in Africa and Asia. This webinar is hosted by the Knowledge Platform for Inclusive and Sustainable Food Markets and Value Chains, KISM. KISM is part of the CGIAR initiative on rethinking food markets and implemented in partnership with ISIL and Evidencia. I'm Carla Rodriguez, project coordinator at Impacts and Innovations for ISIL and part of the KISM implementation team. Next, please. So the agenda for today, this webinar hosted by the CGIAR initiative on rethinking food markets provide an opportunity to learn how MSME value chains condition climate resilience of vulnerable households and farms in Africa and Asia. So we will have first a space for a welcome and housekeeping, followed by welcome remarks by our moderator today, Rob Boss, Director of Markets, Trades and Institutions Unit at IFPRI and lead of the Rethinking Food Markets Initiative at CGIAR. Then this will be followed by a presentation on the topic that we are covering today by Thomas Reardon, professor at the Department of Agriculture, Food and Research Economics at Michigan State University and non-resident senior research fellow at IFPRI. We will also have a discussion space. This will be led by Nicolas Minot, Senior Manager Fellow and Deputy Director Markets, Trade and Institutions Unit at IFPRI. We will also have a space for Q&A and finally a quick closing space as well, led by Swati Malhotra, Communications Officer at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. Next, please. So before I talk a bit more about this webinar, I would like to share with you some session guidelines. Once panelists have shared their views, we will open for questions from the audience, and we invite you to get engaged actively. Also, bear in mind that this session it's being recorded, and this will be shared with all participants on the KISM webpage within 2 weeks. We appreciate you sharing the questions at any time during the event via the chat function on the Zoom platform. Please indicate to which panelist your question is directed, if applicable, and please also indicate your name and affiliation. This Zoom meeting allows for audio and video participation from all participants. So if you would like to ask questions using audio, please use the raise hand function during the Q&A round and to pose your question. Next, please. Okay, so before we begin, I would like to introduce KISM. So KISM is a research and knowledge gateway to help farmers, organizations, food businesses, governments, and practitioners to make better informed investment and policy decisions on inclusive and sustainable food value chains. Situated within the CGIAR initiative on rethinking food markets, the KISM is designed to share cutting-edge research emerging from this multidisciplinary research initiative and convene stakeholder dialogues to make sense of this research and improve policy coherence and market reform. KISM is also your gateway to access further credible research and data in the field through other knowledge platforms such as Evidencia and Value Chains Knowledge Portal. Next, please. The KISM is a research library and a knowledge platform for policy, dialogue, and exchange of ideas on rethinking food markets and value chains. KISM's library hosts all the resources on the site. You can find a compilation of information and insights published by the Rethinking Food Markets Initiative, as well as resources accessed through other credible databases, such as the Evidencia platform. KISM is also a space for engaging with other working in the area to collectively find ways to inform action through the events and discussions. Next. KISM exists to share emerging research from the CGI Rethinking Markets Initiative that looks at innovations within three broad areas: globally integrated value chains, which have vertical integration, food standards certification, and inclusive value chain contracting; domestic food market value chains. Within you find sustainable value chain infrastructure, product upgrading, and inclusive business models. And third will be cross-market services. We're talking about logistics innovations and digital finance for inclusive value chain integration. So today's webinar sits within the CGIAR initiative work package for knowledge tools for policy coherence and market reform for inclusive and sustainable food market transformation. You can easily find all the knowledge products published by work package 4 in the library. You will also have access to the recording of the webinar and a blog summarizing the key insights in KISM. Now, I would like to pass over, if we can go next, thank you, to Rob Boss, who will be moderate today this webinar. And thank you again for joining this webinar today. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you for this very useful introduction to the knowledge platform, but also to the research initiative. We've had quite a few webinars over the past year already using the knowledge platform, and including several conversations with Professor Tom Reardon. And today we'll hear more from him. And in the previous webinars, we've particularly been discussing areas of how food value chains in developing country contexts are changing, are sort of revolutionizing the way we produce and get the food to consumers, with a lot of emphasis on one of the legs of the Rethinking Food Markets Initiative, which is on inclusiveness and who are the actors that are driving this dynamics and who are benefiting in the course of the changes that are taking place. Today's seminar, we want to focus a little bit more on one of the other legs of the or the other leg of the initiative, which is on sustainability, more specifically on what is the role of medium and small scale enterprises and smallholders in the development of the value chains and the vertical integration, and how that influences the resilience to climate shocks, as we're seeing today, and we'll be seeing more intense climate shocks affecting food supply chains moving forward. So we'll be very interested to hear from Tom, his insights in the experience of food value chain development and the impact on climate resilience in the African and Asian context. His introduction will be followed by some discussion and comments from Nick Meinert, who's the work package lead for one of the areas of work within the Rethinking Food Markets initiative. And then we'll open up for Q&A. And as Carla already explained, please, as the seminar moves forward, so please feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat box. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Tom Reardon for his introductory remarks. I don't have to introduce him again because Carla already did, and I think by now everybody knows Tom very well. Over to you, Tom.
Mute. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, very good.
Okay,
You can put in presentation mode, and then we go. We're off. Excellent.
Yes, I've had so much training on this the past 4 years, living in the Zoom sphere. It's a pleasure to speak to you this morning, and the topic is how micro, small, and medium enterprises, that's a big mouthful, they used to be called SMEs, now MSMEs, along value chains condition climate resilience of vulnerable households and farms in Africa and Asia. We start with maybe an obvious point and something that's been discussed so much in the past couple years, but the fact is that African and Asian rural households and farms are constantly pummeled by and beset by climate shocks and change, and this is getting more and more intensive. These households seek resilience, both in general to violence, to climate shocks, to many kinds of shocks, but today we're focusing on climate shocks, in order to protect their overall livelihoods, which go beyond their farming, as we'll see, such as into their rural non-farm employment and their farms. And in this context, the climate debate has so far mainly focused on the farm level and much less on the overall food system or food value chains that the farmers face in various ways. So it's been relatively neglected to focus on the value chain aspect, although not absent, but so far not anywhere nearly as much as we would like. So we then undertook a paper both for this initiative and for the Cell Journal to analyze conceptually and provide illustrations and evidence of the various channels of the impacts of value chains on the resilience of rural households and farms in these regions. We used various sources for this paper: household survey data, our own primary surveys of traders and other midstream MSMEs, and a review of the literature. We will focus on MSMEs rather than big companies such as supermarkets and large processors, because the very great majority of small and medium farmers in Africa and Asia face in markets the MSMEs with very little interface with big companies. So we focus on the micro, small, and medium enterprises in the value chains faced by these farmers. And in this paper, we don't cover formal contract farming or export value chains, which we treat in a separate paper in a separate talk. There are really four kinds of value chains that are relevant to farm and household resilience. We say farms to separate it a little bit from households, in that farms are one, or farming is one enterprise of rural households. So these households and these farms face four markets. One is the value chain for outputs from the farms. The second, also a value chain, also extremely important, is the value chain that supplies food to rural households, that, as we'll see, purchase a great deal of their food. And then, relevant to their climate resilience, are value chains that supply inputs such as fertilizer and seed, and even information, and various kinds of agricultural services to farmers. And finally, relatively neglected in the debate, but also a value chain, are what we call lateral value chains, like value chains of logistics that supply all the other segments of the value chain. So there's four kinds of value chains that will show, and the punchline of the talk will be, these 4 value chains are very crucial to the climate resilience of rural households and farm households in these regions. Stepping back, sorry for my allergies. Stepping back, I just want to remind you, and it's not necessary probably for the Rethinking Markets Initiative participants, but more generally, just remind you of the importance of value chains to food security of urban areas and rural areas in Africa and Asia. Very roughly, 60% of national food consumption in these regions is undertaken by urban areas. And about the other 40% of national food consumption is undertaken in rural areas. Now, urban areas, as you know, purchase almost all of their food. So this is coming to them from various kinds of value chains. But it's surprising when you think about the fact that from our data, 60 to 70% of rural food consumption is purchased. So food value chains are very important to rural areas, not just to sell to other areas, but to buy from their own area and from other areas. So if you add these numbers up, about 80% of African food consumption is purchased and comes from value chains, and more than 85% of Asian food consumption is purchased and comes from value chains. So these value chains, both short and long, are extremely important to food security. And value chains are important to farmers, obviously also to sell their outputs and buy inputs. And the MSMEs in the midstream of these value chains are extremely important to the overall functioning of the value chains. These include the midstream of output value chains, including wholesalers or traders, processors, and logistics enterprises that are the proximate interface of the farm with the market, of the output market. And then there's also a very important presence of these MSMEs in input value chains. In fact, they dominate by far these input value chains and are sometimes called agro-dealers. Often in the literature and in the debate, there's an image of these actors and these segments of the supply chain as being missing or traditional or stagnant. And our research in the past decade has shown that in great contrast to that image of sleepiness is really a very rapidly expanding and dynamically investing set of entrepreneurs. So the term that's often used is the missing middle for them, but we found that it's not missing. Instead, we call it the hidden middle because it's not missing, but it's often hidden from both the international and the domestic debates. Now let's unpack the influences of these value chains on rural households and farms. And the first step we take is looking at how output value chains affect rural households' climate resilience via the food purchases of rural households. This used to be a very minor and marginal topic 20, 30 years ago, but now is sliding onto center screen because rural households manage and cope with climate shocks, especially by buying food. Nowadays, they buy a lot of their food, even in normal rainfall years. We have a recent paper in Global Food Security that shows for Africa that on average, about 60% of rural food consumption in Africa is purchased. And in various other papers, we've showed that 80 and even more percent of food is purchased in many Asian countries, for example, India. So these purchases are extremely important and stand in contrast to this old idea that farmers grow what they eat and eat what they grow. And the question then comes, what is funding these purchases of food? Sometimes it's sales of cash crops. And very often it's rural non-farm employment undertaken by these rural households. This can be as much as 50% of the total incomes of rural households in Asia, and about 45% of rural households in Africa. This rural non-farm employment via food purchases is a very central element of climate resilience for households in these areas. The double-edged sword to this, the paradox, is that rural non-farm employment is sometimes unequally distributed, with the poorest and most vulnerable having difficulty accessing these jobs, especially in unfavorable zones. So that means that the ability to be resilient is also unequally distributed. Very important is, again, thinking about these value chains that are supplying purchased food to rural areas as well as to cities, and thinking of them as not just being when you purchase food, going to your neighbor and buying some food. This happens, and there are some short value chains within zones. But we found in a lot of our research, for example, tomatoes in Nigeria, tomatoes in Tanzania, many crops in India, crisscross the zones of their country. So they are often medium to long value chains, therefore vulnerable to climate shocks along their length. Again, thinking about the importance of value chains leads us always to think about what that importance might mean in a problematic sense as well. So we're not just saying that it's a positive and unalloyed effect, but there can be a two-edged sword or a paradox related to reliance on food purchases for resilience. On one side, households that rely very little on purchases or have very little ability to rely on purchases are more vulnerable to their local climate shocks on their own food production. Okay, so this is the subsistence household that's buffeted by the local climate. But on the other hand, households that rely a lot on purchases from value chains are vulnerable to the climate shocks that strike the global, let's say the global food economy, as well as the national food economy, or even the rural regions that are supplying food to another rural region that might drive up food prices. So reliance on markets makes you more resilient because you don't rely only on your local production, but it also makes you more vulnerable. So it's a two-edged sword. Let's turn now from food value chains that are supplying food to rural households to input and agricultural services value chains and look at how they affect farm climate resilience. And we're thinking now, picture in your mind the agro dealer that's selling fertilizer or seed or irrigation equipment or greenhouse facilities, etc., to farmers in these areas. And we then in the literature looked at what are the various kinds of inputs and services sold by these agro dealers to farm households that help them to deal with rising and heat, shocks of humidity, droughts. And we came up with a series of interesting examples that we highlight in the paper. The most obvious one, people talk about irrigation as a key way to deal with climate shocks and climate change, but you have to think who is supplying the irrigation equipment. It's coming from a value chain. It's not appearing usually from a project or from a donor or produced by the household. It's being sold by agro dealers. And so we see that irrigation equipment value chains are very important. There's also outsourced services of well excavation that we found in Bangladesh and Myanmar and Ethiopia. So water control inputs. Secondly, are animal feed inputs, which smooth feed supply when you have a climate shock to your local production, for example, of pastures. Very important in Africa. Third, in more and more, we find that these enterprises are selling seeds and breeds of animals that are drought and heat resistant. Examples of those are drought-resistant maize seeds or tropicalized animal breeds such as Noiler chickens in Nigeria or tropicalized cattle in India. The fourth kind of input sold by these enterprises are tropicalized greenhouses. Very interesting example of that in Thailand. Or winterized intermediate technology greenhouses, for example, in China. So the picture in your mind is that these things are often talked about in the literature about climate, but not thought of as things that are delivered by actual agro-dealers that are part of value chains, input value chains. So the functioning of those value chains is the thing that supplies the water control, the feed, the new breeds, and the tropicalized greenhouses, etc. We also looked at examples of various kinds of inputs that are supplied, like herbicides, that are necessary where there's spikes of heat and humidity that produce more weeds. And we have examples of that in India and Mali. Or where heat and humidity create vulnerability and disease among fish and chicken. And the agro-dealers are selling antibiotics to the farmers in those areas. We have examples from Bangladesh and Nigeria. Or vaccinations for tilapia against diseases that spikes when there's climate shocks. So these are sales of these kinds of chemicals that are necessary to be resilient in the face of shock. And we find that input suppliers can also be important after a shock occurs in supplying inputs to the area that's been shocked. And we have an example from cyclone areas in coastal Bangladesh, where input sellers come in after the cyclone and sell fish seed to replace lost fish stock, or they provide services to rehabilitate flooded fields, or they supply labor to repair damaged pond dikes. So a whole set of concrete services and inputs are provided by these input value chains that are central to climate resilience of households. Now, sometimes those input suppliers also provide non-traditional inputs, such as credit and information and delivery. And the input supplier's role that's so important in these positive ways can also constitute a double-edged sword. We always turn to that each time we analyze these supply chains, because relying on the input supply obviously helps you in the face of climate change as well as productivity needs. But the input suppliers are actors or people, and they look at the profitability and the risk and the vulnerability of their own markets that keeps them alive, that's their livelihoods. And sometimes when there's a shock to a particular zone, they pull back from that zone, which then magnifies the effect of the shock on the farmers in that zone. So there's a vulnerability there. The output value chains also are there impacting the farm climate resilience. So now we look at the third kind of value chain, where it's the value chains that take the product from the farmer and then bring it to the market. And this is by far the main way that farmers sell outputs in Africa and Asia. A lot of people think of them as walking to a market or selling to their neighbor, but actually our studies show that the great majority of sales by farmers is going via traders and wholesalers, for example, in these value chains. And so these are the main interface of farmers with what we call the market. And these value chains condition the incentives, including profit and risk, of farmers adopting climate resilience measures. We always think about what are good reasons for farmers to adopt these, if they're subsistence farmers, to protect their livelihoods. But very often, if you look at those inputs that we talked about or output types that are adopted, that constitute measures for climate resilience, we find that there are things that are their adoption is dependent on the profitability and the relative risk of undertaking those measures or producing those products. And you can see this through some of the examples. For example, we found in Rwanda that households that are selling to the urban food markets are far more likely to undertake soil conservation measures such as terracing and use organic matter on their farms. So these commercialization contexts provide strong incentives and capacity to farmers to adopt these climate resilience and productivity enhancing measures. Other examples we found are shade coffee, for example, that's adopted by farmers for the domestic market in Thailand. And we also found that the farmers that are selling to the urban market of vegetables, for example, in Zambia, are far more likely to be adopting irrigation and be climate resilient. And we find other examples, for example, of cooling and cold storage enterprises and supply use by Indian potato farmers that are selling to the urban market. So the key point here is that subsistence farmers often, or sometimes at least, have a much lower incentive and capacity to adopt these measures. And then we find that in situations where those farmers shift to be commercialized farmers selling to the market, the incentive and capacity to adopt those measures goes up a lot. That's what we found in the studies. And sometimes they're helped directly by the wholesalers or processors to adopt these inputs and sell these outputs because these traders, for example, might provide them credit, information, and delivery. Now, again, just as we did in the case of the input supply chains and the food supply chains, in the output supply chains from the farmer to the market, we have to think about what are the vulnerabilities that the provision of these market services create. And one of the double-edged sword, we call them in the paper, is that traders that are buying from particular zones and therefore making production of, let's say, tomatoes more valuable and more profitable from that zone, when there's a climate shock to that zone, they sometimes delist or move away from, pull back from the zones that are climate shocked. So linking to the market has all these benefits, but then also one has to think about the fact that when the shock comes to your zone, sometimes the output traders pull back from the zone. And the second double-edged sword of this is that markets can incentivize farmers to undertake the production of crops and use practices that make them more climate vulnerable. For example, shrimp farming in Indonesia has occasioned mangrove clearing by these shrimp farmers, which increases the climate risk. Or the farmers in various areas, for example, in Zambia, shift into water using and heat-sensitive products like horticulture. And that makes them, again, more vulnerable when there's a water shortage, et cetera, et cetera. And when we looked at these examples and we thought about it, just as in the case of food purchases, just as in the case of buying inputs from supply chains, just as in the case of supplying profitably crops and livestock to urban markets and other markets, the presence of those various markets help the farmers in climate resilience, but also make them more vulnerable. That's the nature of participating in any market. And what we think is that farmers will continue to do that rather than reversing and shifting back to subsistence away from those markets, simply because the farmers have become very attracted to and voted with their feet and their rupees and their shillings to undertake these activities. So I'll wrap up by thinking about, in this very short talk, it's kind of frustrating because there's a lot of exciting examples to go into more depth on. But let me just pull back and say a couple key policy implications of these findings. There's really two key implications. The first is simply that instead of just thinking about climate resilience of households and farms at a farm level and thinking about what can persuade them to do X and Y and Z, we argue in this paper that input, output, and lateral or logistics value chains are crucial to whether farmers and households want to undertake climate resilient activities and whether they can be. In other words, these value chains are central to climate resilience of the farm and rural households in these regions. Which means the second punchline is that policies that support these value chains are climate resilience policies. We always think of policies that provide a culvert or bund or irrigation directly to farmers as a kind of climate resilience policy. But what we're arguing is that the policies that enable value chains should be ranked equally with and part of the basic measures of policymakers to deal with the climate resilience challenge of rural households. And these measures can be hard infrastructure, like roads and wholesale markets and electricity, which I call the blood and bones of the food systems. They can be soft infrastructure, like information and startup loans for these small enterprises. They can be good governance policies. Listen to this: anti-bribe policies that affect markets and roads and value chains are climate resilience policies. They aren't usually ranked as those, but governance policies are also climate resilience policies. And finally, policies that help farmers meet the market requirements to participate in these profitable markets in urban areas are also part of climate resilience, because that provides the incentive and the capacity to undertake many of these measures. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom, for, as always, a very fascinating and stimulating talk. I think you gave some very good examples of how value chain development can help the climate resilience for smallholders, but also for other actors in the market. But I also liked your indication that that can come with a double-edged sword. There could be trade-offs in the sense that such dependence on certain supply chains can also increase the vulnerability to such shocks if other actors withdraw or stop providing inputs or providing a supply channel for smallholder farmers to the markets that they normally rely on. So I think that will give quite a bit of stuff for discussion and rethinking, as we do in the initiative, rethinking markets and value chains. So to kick off our discussion, I'll give the floor to Nick Meinert, who's the Deputy Director in the Markets Institutions and Markets Trade and Institutions unit at IFPRI, and also a work package lead in the initiative. That said, let me repeat the invitation to submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box or in the chat box. So without further ado, Nick, over to you for your comments and further reflections. Over to you, Nick.
Okay, great. I have my video on, but it's not, at least I can't see it. But anyway, I will proceed. So anyway, thanks for that introduction, Rob, and thanks, Tom, for this really interesting paper. I think it's very ambitious to cover such a broad topic and in such a short time, and but I think you've really covered a lot of material. So I think a number of key points in Tom's presentation. I like the classification of the food value chains. You've got ag inputs, ag marketing.
Nick, could you please try turning your video on again?
We can't hear Nick. Nick, you are silent now.
I think he's.
Okay, I keep turning on the video and then it turns itself off for some
Maybe
reason.
just leave your video off then, Nick, and just do it. We will listen to you and imagine.
Okay, well, I'll leave it on for now, but it may turn off. I'm not hitting the button myself. Okay, so Tom talked about the 4 different types of value chains and how they cater to farmers and rural household needs in different ways. I think his point that a large share of food is purchased is really important, and also the fact that most food is actually marketed from rural areas to rural areas rather than rural areas to urban areas, as we often think of them. We did some work, value chain study in Ethiopia some years ago, and was kind of surprised to see that a large share of the wheat and maize was not being sold to Addis Ababa, but to other rural areas, food deficit areas. Tom always makes the point about rapid technical change in agricultural and food value chains. I think this is important, particularly given the changes that climate change are bringing. We hope, we want the value chains to be adaptable and dynamic in response to changing needs due to climate change. And he gives a number of examples, some really interesting examples of agro-dealers catering to farmer needs, irrigation services, animal feed, pest control, drought-resistant varieties, and so on. And then wraps up with policy implications, roads, wholesale markets, electricity, information, startup credit, and good governance. I think in terms of my response to this, I think it's really useful to separate mitigation and adaptation. In the case of adaptation to climate change, farmers, there's a demand. Farmers want to grow crops that are not going to be affected by drought or not going to be, not going to have a crop failure in the case of bad weather. So that creates a demand for seed and inputs and so on. On the other hand, mitigation is not always in the farmer's interest. You have situations where you don't want farmers to do things that would otherwise be profitable because it increases emissions. Some examples of that, I know in Work Package 1, our Central American team is looking at coffee sales to the European Union, and Europe will soon be requiring exporters, coffee exporters and others, to demonstrate that the land that the coffee is grown on hasn't recently been deforested. So this means sort of a system of certification and so on. But this is not something that small-scale enterprises or even large-scale enterprises could do, because it involves going against the farmers' sort of private interests. Possibility of carbon credits for protecting forests, the carbon footprint associated with food production, particularly for beef, dairy, and rice, which produce methane. So these are areas, types of mitigation that are not necessarily in the farmer's immediate self-interest, and therefore not something that that small-scale or large-scale enterprises can deal with. This is more of a policy issue. I think Tom provides a useful reminder that medium and small scale enterprises may offer a double-edged sword. They're catering to farmers' demand, but that farmers' demand may be for drought-resistant varieties, or it could be for environmentally damaging practices. To take a super concrete example, small-scale enterprises are probably selling chainsaws to cattle farmers in the Amazon. So I think we need to think of small, medium enterprises as pretty neutral on climate change. They are good at catering to the demand from farmers, from rural households, but this may be positive or negative. And I think Thomas has mentioned that. I guess one way to think of it is that they will be useful, constructive in catering to farmers' demand to adapt to climate change, but they often will not be very helpful in addressing mitigation. And this brings me to sort of a broader point that, I know that the mandate for this paper is to focus on medium and small enterprises and micro. But there is also a role, I think the government needs to play a pretty big role in investing in research for climate smart seeds and practices, creating institutions to document climate friendly practices like non-deforestation and things like that. And in providing incentives for reducing emissions in transport and processing, including food processing. And without these, the medium and small and micro enterprises won't have an incentive to address the mitigation side of climate change. Of course, they will continue to address the adaptation side. I guess one more comment is about the policy implications. I think most of us would agree that infrastructure, good governance, grades and standards are worthy goals. Not always easy to do in practice, but certainly worthy goals. There's not so much controversy about them because they're good for farmers and they're also good for climate. When I say grades and standards, I'm including like sustainability standards and things like that, which will become increasingly important over time. Yes, local and international trade will be needed to mitigate local weather shocks. I think Tom is right that, in most cases, being connected to markets reduces your risks overall. It sort of spreads the risk associated with climate change. And the government has long provided information to farmers about production methods through extension services and so on. It probably needs to, I know Tom's a little skeptical about this, but I think that it needs to expand into providing market and weather information. We may not have the right formula yet, but I think these are things that information is a public good, and weather information will certainly become even more important as the effects of climate change become more obvious. But there are other topics which don't involve this kind of win-win situation. For example, does a more volatile production and food markets, does that call for larger public grain reserves, or is it something that can be handled by private traders? Should trade policy be used to stabilize domestic prices in light of the fact that in stabilizing domestic prices, they may contribute to price volatility on the international market? Will Martin has done some interesting work on that, which is worth looking at. What's the best way to certify sustainable production methods by farmers? And finally, how can governments promote the provision of credit to small farmers given the high cost of enforcement for repayment? So so those are sort of my main points. I think I certainly agree with the main policy recommendations that Tom presents. I think there are a number of other issues that are not as easy to address, but certainly matter a great deal in terms of policy related to climate change. I have a couple other points here, but I think I will stop here. I'll deliver these comments to the rest of the comments to Tom directly. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for broadening up the scope of the discussion. So feed it back to Tom. But before doing that, there's everybody has received a pop-up message to respond to a poll. So please respond to the poll if you've seen that and could access that. But let's continue with the discussions. We do have to stop at 10 o'clock since others have some other engagements after this. But maybe Tom, you could first address some of the next main points. So maybe the distinction between adaptation and mitigation, what it means to farmers' coping mechanisms, and also for policies. Then there's also I think it's part of one of the comments made by Nick, but also comments made by Flavio Linares, who asked about, well, what about technical assistance to farmers as key elements to empower them for adoption of climate smart agriculture or regenerative agriculture. I guess that's a question about, okay, how do you relate sort of the adaptation at the farm level that could be done with the importance of the value chain development, and how you would weigh that also policy-wise. And then there's more, another question, and I'll give it back to you, is that are there any specific key actions that the small and medium enterprises could do themselves to support climate change resilience or climate resilience along food value chains, for instance, by developing new products or providing complementary services? Let me give that with sort of a handful of questions back to you, Tom, and reflect on those and give you further insights to the topics that we're discussing here. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And thanks, Nick, for your comments. Very useful. I have 4 points, and the first 2 follow Nick's points and reply to them, and then the other 2 follow the several comments. The paper focuses on adaptation, essentially, resilience. And we purposefully don't frontally discuss mitigation of climate change, but it comes out in some ways in the sense that in some of the examples we use, we show that actions that farmers are helped to take that help them to be resilient in the face of shocks also can create further climate problems even in their specific areas and make them more vulnerable to those shocks. So we bring in mitigation in the paper that way indirectly, but sidestep it in terms of the which we deal with in a different paper, which is to what extent these actors can affect whether farmers are creating more climate problem or reducing the climate problem itself. And so that's one thing. And I think your point about, very important point, Nick, I think, is that we can say whatever we want about climate change and the world falling apart, but the farmers are sitting there on a year-to-year basis, living or dying, and they are choosing things that help them to usually not just be resilient, but make more money and improve their lot, right, and get out of poverty. And some of those choices are things that make them more vulnerable, make them perhaps create a climate problem, but they're things that they're intensively doing. We see that there's our Zambia work, 200,000 small farmers entered commercial vegetable production in 10 years, right? They're running toward it. This is irrigation facilities. This is using these inputs. And so there's a powerful surge of farmers toward these actions. And we're trying to understand, how does the value chain make them less vulnerable from the adaptation point of view within those? Okay. Second point, very important, is that the government is really the upstream actor when we're talking about Noilers or tropicalized cattle, etc. The government is an upstream actor in agricultural research institutes, etc., that create these breeds. But the paper is reminding the reader that none of this gets to the farmer except in a few little projects where farmers are handed these things directly. All of it almost gets to farmers through the value chains. Private sector, small player value chains deliver all these new kinds of inputs and practices to farmers. And so the key thing is to think about the upstream as necessary but not sufficient for farmers to get these climate resilient inputs, for example. Third point, very fascinating point about farmer technical assistance. And one thing that really comes to mind, and I didn't have time, 20-minute talk is a little challenging, probably I even took 30 minutes. But the key thing is that these traders and processors really want the farmers to survive. Think about that. These are their bread and butter. These are their lifeline to the market. If the farmers fail because of climate shocks, the traders are destroyed. The processors fall apart. So they have a lot of skin in the game to pass information to farmers about what works better. And we have various examples of that in the paper. Also, though, there is a value to have assistance, of technical assistance, to teach the midstream itself, small and medium enterprises, for example, how to deal, for example, with aflatoxin in the maize or the peanuts, right? Because that can be spiked by the heat and humidity, and that then undermines their business and the supply chain and food security. So technical assistance coming from these enterprises, technical assistance to those enterprises, are other elements that can be taken into account. And finally, this is an example from Ben Belton in the paper, which I just think is so beautiful. And the person that brought up the chat point about new services, these entrepreneurs are really the heroes in creativity and innovation to deal with new shocks. Again, because they have skin in the game. So you have a cyclone that hits southern Bangladesh, and flooding into it come the traders and other actors that are and input suppliers, pond excavators, et cetera, that are coming to repair the damage. It's like white blood cells in a human body, right? When there's an infection, inflow these enterprises to deal with the problem. And it's not just for development angle. They're coming in to restore their golden goose, their suppliers, their supply region, right? So they have a business reason to flood in. And so they can be very important, and they're very innovative in discovering new services that can do that, as well as services that can help them to mitigate, help farmers to mitigate the shocks itself. Or, for example, the work by IFPRI in Ethiopia, where you have outsourced pond well excavation services that are going into the vegetable areas and digging the wells, and also pond excavation services, and also in Bangladesh. And so they're very innovative in supplying these services, and they might just be as innovative as us. We're the international community. We're thinking about what the heck farmers should do to get out of the mess. Day and night, the people that depend on those farmers for their livelihoods, these enterprises in these supply chains, are also thinking. Maybe we should talk and exchange information between them and us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom. I think we have to get to the end of this seminar, which is very important because there are quite a few questions still in the chat box. Though you've done a miraculous job, even preempting some of those questions by answering them in passing already. But what we'll do is we'll collect the questions as they have been sent in, and share some answers with you to those questions in the follow-up to this seminar. So with that, let me thank Tom for another excellent presentation. We'll share the paper once it's fully ready with all the participants, and also thanks to Nick for his initial comments, and everybody else for submitting your questions online. With that, I give it back to Swati to close out this seminar.
Thank you, Rob. And thank you to everybody for being such a splendid audience today. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. For a summary webinar recording, please watch out the space on KISM. It is kismfoodmarkets.org. That is the website. And to be in the loop of all upcoming events, activities, and new resources, please join our newsletter with the QR code you see on the screen. We also invite you to join it by going to the KISM website, which is KISM, K-I-S-M, foodmarkets.org, and click subscribe on the top menu bar. With that, I thank you again for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists, our moderator, and the entire team. I'm Swati Malhotra, Communications Officer with IFPRI, and I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks.